Tom Baker's portrayal as the Fourth Doctor is seen by many as the definitive performance of the Time Lord, in particular fans who edge closer to the classic series, and, I have to admit, he is also my favourite. During his 7-year stint, the show reached new heights of popularity, which was reflected in ratings, as well as many of his stories considered some of the best ever in the show's history. However, all good things must come to an end, and on the 21st of March 1981, the Fourth Doctor made way for the fifth, with episode 4 of Legopolis, which also concluded season 18, which saw arguably the most accumulative changes made to Doctor Who both in front and behind the camera since it began in 1963. But how did it affect the performance and legacy of Tom Baker's status in the role, and ultimately, could it have ended better for him? Let's take a look. Tom Baker's penultimate season, season 17, had been an indifferent one to say the least. On paper, the show was having a renaissance in ratings, with episode 4 of City of Death bringing in a record 16.1 million viewers for the show. However, these ratings boosts were due in part to rival Channel ITV being on strike in an age of British television when the only available channels were BBC 1 and 2 and ITV itself. In general, the season is regarded as one of Tom Baker's weaker ones, with criticism regarding the level of humour injected to the show, which had gradually increased during producer Graham Williams' tenure, but given to the max partly due to the freedom Tom Baker was given in the role, as well as Douglas Adams being hired as script editor. Additionally, certain stories were showing the strain of a shrinking budget, and the BBC even experienced strike action of their own, resulting in the final story, the six-parter Sharda, not being finished, and ultimately never broadcasted. By the time season 17 had come to its abrupt end, Graham Williams had decided to move on after 3 years in the role, as well as Douglas Adams, whose increasing popularity and reputation led to him stepping down as script editor after just 1 season to focus on the TV adaptation of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which he had written. A new regime was on the horizon. BBC management's first choice to succeed Graham Williams was George Galaccio, who had served as production unit manager from 1974 to 1976, but he turned it down. Eventually, the role went to John Nathan Turner. Unlike some of his predecessors such as Philip Hinchcliffe and Graham Williams, Nathan Turner was already working on the show, like Galaccio, in a role of production unit manager since 1977. This had allowed him to form a first-hand assessment on the status of the show and what he felt needed to be done to give him some rejuvenation, an approach he would carry on throughout his own tenure as producer, and ultimately the rest of the classic series. Having never held the role of producer before, and being at a relatively young age of 32, the BBC hierarchy decided that John Nathan Turner needed an experienced hand to help him into the role for his first season. This responsibility was handed to former Doctor Who producer Barry Letts, who was appointed in the capacity of executive producer. Completing the appointments was Christopher H. Bidmead, in the role of script editor, after a recommendation from former Doctor Who writer Robert Banks Stewart. With the new production team in place, John Nathan Turner set about with his new broom philosophy to refresh Doctor Who. His 3 years in the capacity of production unit manager allowed him to see firsthand at what he perceived as what needed changing. In an interview conducted in 1994, his opinion of the previous regime was that despite the low budgets and limited recording time, there was a mentality of "that'll do," rather than trying to do your best. Personally, I can see his reasoning, and you only need to look at stories like Underworld or The Power of Kroll to see how the budget limitations of the story let it down, or The Nightmare of Eden or The Horns of Nimon, where scripting or production issues also hampered the story. The first notable change John Nathan Turner made was one based on not it necessarily being poor, but rather being at risk of becoming dated, and that was the title sequence, coupled with the incidental music. Throughout the Tom Baker era, the title sequence used was created by Bernard Lodge, using the slit-scan photographic process, which was seen as a radical achievement in graphic design. John Nathan Turner's argument, however, was that it had been used since 1974, with Tom Baker having noticeably aged over the years in comparison to the image that was being used. Sid Sutton was brought in to create a completely new title sequence, which became known as the Starfield sequence, keeping in theme with Lodge's original concept of travelling through time and space. To tie in with the new title sequence, Nathan Turner enlisted Peter Howell from the BBC Radiophonic Workshop to compose a new arrangement, a daring move from Delia Derbyshire's infamous arrangement, which had been regarded as an icon of the show. Derbyshire's arrangement of Ron Grainer's composition was done using the ideologies of musique concrète, which involved using recorded sounds for the raw material of a piece of music. Although musique concrète was a form of avant-garde music, one of its natural successors was the use of synthesizers, with the technology having become more accessible and mainstream throughout the 1970s and into the 80s, and therefore seemed natural to be the basis of Howell's new arrangement to bring the theme tune up to date into the 1980s. This also bled through into the incidental music, which during the majority of Tom Baker's tenure had been handled mostly by Dudley Simpson and his team of session musicians, which, like Derbyshire's arrangement of the theme tune and Lodge's title sequence, were fitting for the time, but Nathan Turner was critical that some of Simpson's work had become repetitive, and like the updated theme tune, he used the talents of the BBC Radiophonic Workshop to compose synthesized incidental music, bringing again the show into the 1980s. In addition to Peter Howell, fellow Radiophonic Workshop colleagues Paddy Kingsland and Roger Limb provided the incidental music for all of season 18's stories. One of John Nathan Turner's biggest criticisms of his predecessor's regime was the level of humour that had been injected and become more prominent, particularly when Douglas Adams was script editor. This was initially brought in by Graham Williams to contrast the horror theme of the Philip Hinchcliffe era, but the coupled input from Douglas Adams and Tom Baker's greater influence on the show had made season 17 very slapstick and silly in terms of humour. Nathan Turner and script editor Christopher H. Bidmead decided to draw back the humour and bring a more serious tone to the narrative. This was done firstly by bringing in a bigger focus on hard science and introducing scientific studies such as tachyons, evolution, and entropy into the narrative. While the Fourth Doctor was toned down, it wasn't eradicated totally, with him providing the usual quips you expect from the character early in the season, such as his "arrest the scarf" line from the Leisure Hive. But gradually, the humour of the Fourth Doctor was subdued over the course of the season, and by the time we reached the final story of Logopolis, Tom Baker is playing the character, arguably more serious than he ever had done over the 7 years. With the overhaul came a change of companions to instill the new feel of the show. This wasn't particularly anything new with producers of the past and showrunners of the present, but not quite at the swiftness that John Nathan Turner had in mind, with the lead characters that started the season debut of the Leisure Hive having all changed by the time we get to the closing scene as the season finale of Logopolis. In terms of departures, the first victim was K9, who had been part of the show either as Mark 1 or Mark 2 since 1977. As a prop, it had been a hindrance and a problem for some time, with the production team, as well as John Nathan Turner and Christopher H. Bidmead, seeing the character as a plot device that provided an easy and simplistic fix for the Doctor to get out of difficult situations. Straight away, in the opening scene of the season opener of the Leisure Hive, you have K9 becoming incapacitated when blowing up after venturing into the sea at Brighton Beach. This put the robotic dog out of action for the rest of the story, and a large part of the following story, Meglos, before getting limited action for the rest of the season before finally being left behind in Warriors Gate. Despite the annoyance of K9 as a character and a prop, it was still a risky decision as it was popular with children and was a marketable product for the BBC. Nathan Turner did actually value K9 in regards of audience popularity and pushed for the pilot of a potential spin-off K9 and Company featuring former companion Sarah Jane Smith, which was broadcasted after the conclusion of season 18, but didn't progress onto anything permanent. The next character to be listed for departure was the Time Lady Romana, part of the show since season 16, albeit in 2 incarnations, with Mary Tam having played the first incarnation for a single season, and Lalla Ward taken over as the second incarnation from season 17. The character was almost on a par with the Doctor in terms of intellect, but initially acted like a fish out of water, with lack of experience of life beyond Gallifrey. Over time, Romana evolved, which was good from a character perspective, as she became more prominent in playing a role in creating a narrative resolution to a story, but become removed in the role of companion as an audience representation, or being rescued from a scenario by the Doctor. Like K9, Romana departed in the story Warriors Gate. However, an eventual closure to her progression was introduced at the end of Meglos, with the Time Lord summoning her and the Doctor back to Gallifrey. This harked back to her initially being released from Gallifrey to assist the Doctor in finding the key to time, and this had now become the initial cause for her departure. Eventually, the character elected to stay in the universe of E-Space with K9, so the Time Lords couldn't reach her. The replacement companions all represented the upcoming young image that Nathan Turner had envisioned for the upcoming Fifth Doctor era, and for the first time since the Patrick Troughton era, the Doctor would travel with 3 companions. The first new arrival was the young boy Adric, who debuted in the story Full Circle and stowed away onto the TARDIS. an artful Dodger-style character with an advanced talent in mathematics, and became a sort of apprentice-style character to the Fourth Doctor. This role would change, however, with the advent of the Fifth Doctor era, and ultimately, the character was negatively perceived. The next character was Nyssa, a young female scientist who made an initial one-off appearance in the season's penultimate story, The Keeper of Traken, but impressed John Nathan Turner enough to make her a permanent character in the finale of Legopolis, and progressing on to the Fifth Doctor era. The final new companion to join was Tegan Javanka, a human character from Australia who stumbled upon the TARDIS in Legopolis. Not equipped with a high degree of intelligence compared to her companions Adric and Nyssa, her character evolved in being brash and outspoken. Ultimately, these three characters were designed to fit in with the Fifth Doctor era, with Adric only having enough story time to form a bond with the Fourth Doctor. However, this allowed the following season 19 to focus on the bonds with the characters and the Fifth Doctor. The last notable change brought in by John Nathan Turner to season 18 was the costume of the Fourth Doctor, which was ultimately watered down from the initial ideas, would have a legacy of all future Doctors. Concept for change came about when costume designer June Hudson noticed the original scarf that the Fourth Doctor had been wearing so far throughout his tenure hadn't been looked after properly and was in disrepair. The initial idea was to create a whole new costume for the Fourth Doctor, but June Hudson realised that the scarf was often used as a prop by Tom Baker, as a form of extension to his character. Therefore, a redesign of the setup of scarf and coat was updated with a burgundy theme, with a new scarf created. Another introduction to the costume was the inclusion of the question marks added to the collars of the Doctor's shirts. This would continue with the Fifth and Sixth Doctor, with the Seventh Doctor bringing the tradition to his umbrella handle and jumper, carrying on the question mark theme. An idea of John Nathan Turner's, this would gain a negative response from not only fans but some of the actors playing the Doctor, who saw it as cliché and ultimately exemplifies John Nathan Turner's decision-making, often being polarising, even at this early stage of his career as producer on Doctor Who. Despite all of these changes, John Nathan Turner didn't abandon everything that had developed from the previous regimes. His time worked on the show in the 3 years prior to his appointment had allowed him to establish some continuity of narrative elements. Some of these included the opening scene in the Leisure Hive at Brighton Beach, where the Doctor remarked that it was the second time he had missed the opening of the Brighton Pavilion, which was a throwback to the 1977 story, The Horror of Fang Rock, where the Doctor was also aiming to land at Brighton. Other narrative throwbacks include the already mentioned Time Lord summoning of the Doctor and Romana back to Gallifrey, linking to the Key to Time season, as well as the use of the randomizer the Doctor had installed in the TARDIS to evade the Black Guardian, which had been included at the conclusion of the Key to Time and played a prominent role in season 17. The biggest narrative throwback, though, was the inclusion of the Master returning as a semi-regular character for the first time since the John Pertwee era. Re-establishing a humanoid form from his previous emaciated look, the role became exclusively performed by Anthony Ainley for the remainder of the classic series, with an image akin to previous actor Roger Delgado. This represented a continuity of John Nathan Turner's, in which he would often resort to reintroducing antagonists of old as a means to maintain the link with the show's history. John Nathan Turner would eventually become notorious for his reluctance of resorting to writers and directors who had contributed to previous regimes, and season 18 saw a whole new degree of directors debuting on the show with mixed results. A similar trait was carried out with writers with Andrew Smith, Andrew McCulloch and John Flanagan, Stephen Gallagher, Johnny Byrne and even script editor Christopher H. Bidmead, all making their writing debuts to the show. However, he also reached out to writers David Fisher and Terence Dix, who had contributed prior to John Nathan Turner's appointment. This was a rare move, though, from Nathan Turner, as he would already reach out to one other experienced Doctor Who writer during his tenure, with that being Robert Holmes from 1984 through to his death in 1986. Other than these exceptions, this was another trait of John Nathan Turner to give opportunities to new talent, once again holding mixed results. With all these changes in place, there was a realisation that John Nathan Turner was intending to have a stronger creative control in order to push through these dramatic changes to Doctor Who, which was helped with the experienced hand of Barry Letts. To Tom Baker, though, this meant that the creative freedom he was given under Graham Williams had been reduced under this regime. In addition, Baker also didn't personally agree with some of the changes made to the show, and may be going against the grain of his chosen character. He realised in the end that he himself may be the obstacle in allowing all these changes to flourish and bring in a new era of Doctor Who. With that in mind, Tom Baker informed the production team that he intended to leave the role. This wasn't the first time he had offered his resignation from the role, and had done it previously under the tenure of Graham Williams, who had always managed to persuade Baker to change his mind and stay on. However, this time there was no attempted persuasion from Nathan Turner, who maybe also thought that along the same lines to bring in a new doctor to oversee his new ideas. This could be viewed as the final piece of the jigsaw in John Nathan Turner's new broom philosophy of refreshing Doctor Who. With all the changes that John Nathan Turner decided to bring in over the course of Season 18, what are the actual stories like and how did they initially fare? The first notable change to the season format was that it had been allocated an additional 2 episodes, bringing it to 28 from the standard 26 that had been in place throughout the majority of the Tom Baker era. Also, every story is 4 episodes long, as opposed to 5 4-episode stories and 1 6-episode story that had become the standard season breakdown. This meant that Season 18 had 7 stories rather than 6. Also, Season 18 is seemingly broken down into 3 sections. The first section consists of the opening 2 stories, The Leisure Hive and Meglos. These 2 stories are fairly simplistic in terms of narrative, but an opportunity to show off the new visual style that John Nathan Turner was pushing. This was noticeable in the use of production technologies such as the short-lived CSO successor SceneSync used in Meglos, and the more successful quantal image processing system that was used in The Leisure Hive. Whilst the stories themselves won't necessarily go down as some of the all-time great classics, it certainly gave Nathan Turner the opportunity to start pushing his ideas. The second section of Season 18 comprised a mini-story arc, the E-Space Trilogy. 3 stories that saw the TARDIS sucked into a bubble universe known as E-Space, whilst en route back to Gallifrey. Whereas The Leisure Hive and Meglos were all about showing off the new stylistic visuals, the E-Space Trilogy set the wheels in motion for the change of characters. The first story, Full Circle, saw the introduction of entering E-Space, as well as the introduction of Adric, amongst the story of the progression of evolution. Once again, the narrative was simplistic, but it serves a purpose in the starting of a story arc and the introduction of a new companion. The second story of the trilogy was State of Decay, which had its origins in a modified, old unused script by veteran writer Terrance Dicks from 3 years earlier to fit in with the new look of the show. With a narrative around ancient vampires, its original gothic theme had been subdued in favour of adapting it to the story arc, with the inclusion of the theory of the law of consonantal shift which was developed by the brothers Grimm. The intended changes to the script by Christopher H. Bidmead met with disapproval from both Terrance Dicks and director Peter Moffat, and in the end a compromise was met with elements of Dick's original script and Bidmead's new ideas. The story also served as a vehicle to establish the character of Adric, who was stowed away on the TARDIS at the end of Full Circle, and this served as his first true story as him being one of the Doctor's own companions. The final story was Warrior's Gate, which served as the conclusion of the trilogy. As a story itself, it is both stylistic in terms of visuals and a narrative that jumps from the past, present and into the future, without the use of the TARDIS. Its unique style brought about frustrations between John Nathan Turner and director Paul Joyce, which saw the latter temporarily sacked from his position, only to be later reinstated to finish the job off. Ultimately, it saw the departures of Romana, who chose to stay behind in E-Space so that she was permanently out of reach from the Time Lords. It also saw the departure of K9, but in a far more hastened way, where the Doctor left the robotic dog with Romana on the basis that it wouldn't survive the crossing out of E-Space. The trilogy story arc in the end provided viewers with 3 different narratives, which ultimately played a role in the beginning of the removal of the vestiges of the previous regime and the introduction of Nathan Turner's and Bidmead's narrative and character introductions, which set the audience up for the final section of the Season 18 and the final act of the 4th Doctor era. Keeper of Traken saw the Doctor travelling solely, in part, with a male companion for the first time since the Patrick Troughton era, with Adric, albeit a companion with dubious decision-making, becoming a sort of apprentice to the Doctor, which would stay in place for the remainder of the season. The story itself saw the introduction of another young intelligent character in Nyssa, albeit at this point she was only initially realised as a one-off character. The story centred around an alien presence trying to gain power by becoming the keeper of the Traken Union. Its true nature and its role in Season 18's larger narrative was the reintroduction of the Doctor's arch-nemesis, the Master, for the first time since 1976, the Deadly Assassin. Designed to be a shock reveal, it perhaps wasn't executed as well as it could have been, but once again set about the wheels in motion for the antagonist reintroduction. The impression of the character in Nyssa left on John Nathan Turner also played a role in the remainder of the season. The final story of Season 18 and the 4th Doctor era was Logopolis, which I have done a detailed review of in another one of my videos. In total, it not only serves as an ending, but a culmination of many of the narrative ideas placed in throughout the season by John Nathan Turner and Christopher H. Bidmead. The Doctor is wanting to upgrade and repair the TARDIS, which could be viewed as an allegory for John Nathan Turner's desire to upgrade and repair the show, wrapped up in the scientific principle of entropy. We saw the final introduction of a companion of Tegan, who clearly doesn't click with the Fourth Doctor character, and was very much realised as someone who would be more akin to the incoming Fifth Doctor. The Master's reintroduction was now firmly in place, with the role now played by Anthony Ainley, coupled with Nyssa now becoming attached as a permanent character in a similar fashion to Adric when he joined. For the Doctor himself, there was a sense of looking back with the realisation of Romana and K9 now permanently out of his life, and his supposed random slip into E-space earlier in the season being revealed as something intentional created by the natives of Legopolis to ensure the universe's survival. However, the Doctor has a look towards the future with his meeting with the Watcher, which privately to himself makes him realise his own imminent situation. This creates a sombre mood from the Doctor, which has slowly been deepening into the season as it came to its conclusion. As a result, Legopolis presents itself as a sort of funeral to the Fourth Doctor, and all the pieces now in place set by Nathan Turner and Bidmead over the course of the season to usher in the Fifth Doctor. It is therefore apt that Tom Baker's final lines are, "It's the end, but the moment has been prepared for," a speech that ultimately sums up Season 18's role not for the conclusion of the Fourth Doctor, but for the show's future going into the 80s. On face value, it appears that initially Season 18 had a negative impact on the viewer's reception to the changes. Viewing ratings were low, the lowest the show had seen since closure of the Second Doctor era, never mind the Fourth Doctor's era. Average ratings for the whole of Season 18 were 5.9 million. This was down from an average of 11.2 million from Season 17. However, if you recall at the start of the video, I mentioned that Season 17's ratings was inflated by rival channel ITV that was affected by strike action. ITV would also have an influence on the viewings of Season 18, as it broadcast an American import Buck Rogers, a slicker-looking sci-fi series that started on the same day as the debut of Season 18, therefore putting it in direct competition with Doctor Who. The viewings eventually started to rise though for Doctor Who as the season progressed. However, despite Buck Rogers only lasting 2 seasons, it did prompt the BBC to reschedule Doctor Who away from its traditional Saturday night slot to a new 2-episode midweek slot for the Peter Davison era. This proved a success when Season 19 averaged in 9.3 million viewers. Looking at the individual stories for Season 18, there are none in my opinion at least that jump out and say all-time classics, although Legopolis does seem to split that opinion amongst fans. However, Season 18 as a whole is a sum of its parts, and in the larger spectrum of Doctor Who as a whole, it serves as a transition season in which John Nathan Turner grappled with the pressures of being a producer, whilst also dispensing of what he perceived as old-fashioned and dated approaches and bringing in the new ideas. He was ruthless in his decision-making in not steadily changing things slowly, but doing it wholesale, which could be understandably deter some viewers, especially those who had grown accustomed to Tom Baker as their only Doctor, given the length of his tenure. John Nathan Turner's own ideas were more or less about styles and visuals. This included the reduction of humour, the refreshing of the title sequence, incidental music, and special effects, removal of characters not of his own making, and the introduction of younger naive characters, not just in the companions, but with the Doctor himself, with the eventual introduction of the Fifth Doctor. He wasn't afraid in the hiring of inexperienced writers and directors to the show, which along with the character designs from the new companions had mixed results in the end. But he also didn't entirely shut the door on the past with the reintroduction of the Master, who would appear at least once a year from now until 1986, as well as acknowledging certain other points of the show's past, highlighting that as much as he wanted to attract newer audiences, he didn't want to abandon the established audiences that had been following the show since 1963. For better or for worse, all the ideologies of John Nathan Turner as a producer on Doctor Who are presented in Season 18. Style over substance, with the narrative structures left to the script editor Christopher H. Bidmead, who left at the end of the season only to replace short-term by Anthony Root, but long-term Eric Saywood, who would also have his own narrative ideas. John Nathan Turner to this day divides opinion amongst fans with what he did to the show as producer. I feel with Season 18, he did what was perhaps deemed necessary, and he made bold moves to refresh the show, which ultimately worked, despite the hit-and-miss nature of some of his ideas. This is something he would do more than once throughout the 1980s, as he went on to become the classic series' longest-standing producer, with some of his ideas ultimately backfiring on the show, but nevertheless, John Nathan Turner was a producer, mostly looking to the future and never afraid of trying new things. But where does Season 18 leave the Fourth Doctor and its role as the closing chapter on Tom Baker's tenure? The show undeniably needed a refresh and injection of new ideas, but I do feel this was ultimately at the expense of the Fourth Doctor. A lot of the characteristics are removed, and it is clear that the fun Tom Baker had with the role had ebbed away. The ever-increasing sombre nature of the Fourth Doctor character can be put down to many factors, and not just to the scripts that were being put out. His explosive personality had long since had an effect on members of the production team and fellow actors, but due to him not feeling a part in the new regime, it led to additional friction. You can see this in some of the outtakes of how he seems shorter-tempered, and had gone on to be critical about other aspects, in particular the characterisation of Adric. However, some fans may agree with that opinion. His relationship with Romana actress Lalla Ward had also become romantic, although the pair were known to be hot and cold with each other, which reflected in how they played the characters of each other during some of the stories. The pair did ultimately marry, however it was a marriage that only lasted 18 months. It is sad somewhat, therefore, that the gradual reduction and ultimate death in character of the Fourth Doctor is rolled out in this manner for season 18. I myself can appreciate the larger changes that were needed on the show, but I would like to have seen more of the original Fourth Doctor persona preserved. The comedy element did need toning down, but if you reflect back on the early years of the Tom Baker era, you can clearly see that he was more than capable of a serious nature, while simultaneously maintaining the eccentric nature of the Fourth Doctor, which is also a reflection of the persona of Tom Baker himself. Doctor Who, like all the other actors who have come and gone before and after Tom Baker, has had a massive impact on their acting CVs. Tom Baker, though, went from being an actor struggling for work to being one of the most recognisable actors in the 1970s on British television. Over his long tenure, he lived and breathed the character of the Doctor, with him putting a lot of who he is into the persona of the role. It is therefore understandable that there is a degree of sadness when it was the end of the most successful part of his acting career that was upon him. As a result, he largely started to detach himself from the show, with him quietly leaving after filming his regeneration scene, and for the next few years creating some distance between himself and the show, which is highlighted by his refusal to return for the show's 20th anniversary story, The Five Doctors. However, this was the right time for Tom Baker to go. John Nathan Turner's ideologies clearly didn't fit the Fourth Doctor long term, and had Tom Baker stuck in the role longer, his legacy and reputation would have started to become tarnished. Season 18 may be a removal of style from the Fourth Doctor, and perhaps the character could have been treated differently, but in the end, Tom Baker, John Nathan Turner, and Christopher H. Bidmead make Season 18 a funeral affair for the Fourth Doctor, and thankfully, it didn't influence the overall thought of the fans in the overall opinion on what Tom Baker brought to Doctor Who. This is just my opinion though. This video is designed to form a response and opinion from yourself, as you may think differently. But remember, in the classic words of the Fourth Doctor, it's the end, but the moment has been prepared for.